We are all marketers. We study marketing, we know a lot about marketing, and somehow, when we become authors, we forget about marketing. And it's important to realize that when we're going to get our paper published, what we actually need to do is to convince or to sell our paper to an editor, an AE, and depending on the journal, 2 or 3 reviewers. So we have to market our paper, right? We have to think about carefully how to do that. And so it's clear that we find our research interesting, or I hope so, or otherwise we wouldn't be studying the topic that we're studying. But you have to ask yourself the question, why would it be interesting for other people? So basically, you have to convince other people that it is interesting research that boils down to laying out very explicitly what your contribution is. And the best way of thinking of your contribution is to ask yourself the question, how does my research change the way you think or should think about a phenomenon or an effect? And that's something you need to make clear to that review team. And I think one of the most underrated aspects in trying to sell our research or trying to market our research is the issue of writing. So what we often think of writing is something that comes after doing the research. We've done all the research and now we're going to just write it up and submit it. Ideally, that's not how it works. What is our writing? Our writing is really the package for our research. And again, we're marketers. We know that the package matters. So one of the best pieces of advice I have ever received in my life is that writing is not an afterthought. And in fact, the person who gave me that piece of advice said, when you write your research, when you're in the process of writing up your research, what you need to do is think of the journal you're going to write for. You cannot write a paper you're going to submit to JPSP as if it's a paper for JCR. You cannot write a paper for JCR as if it's a paper for JM, and so on. So every journal has its own kind of way of organizing a paper. So in that process, again, the best piece of advice that I heard is that you have to read the journal. You have to look very critically at what do they do. And ideally, you even read some papers you're not really interested in. Because reading papers you're not interested in, they're going to allow you to focus really on how do people express their ideas, how do they write, how do they organize, what do they do in their paper, instead of, trying to understand the research that you might be interested in. I am an AE at IGRM, and I oftentimes get papers submitted to IGRM where I feel that these people may not ever have read a paper in IGRM. And that's somewhat of a problem because the reviewers for any given journal, they tend to be people who, 1, publish in that journal, and 2, read a lot of papers in that journal. And so they have a particular mental blueprint. So this is what the typical paper in that journal looks like. And if you deviate from that blueprint, for instance, if you deviate in terms of how the paper is organized or the depth of the literature review, if you deviate from the blueprint, it causes some form of disfluency, right? It makes it harder for the reviewers to process your paper. And we all know about the positive effects of fluency. So whenever you create a situation of disfluency, because you write a paper very different from what they would expect for that journal, then that can cause a more negative assessment of your research than is actually warranted from the content of your paper. On top of that, not only do you need to figure out what journal you're going to write for before you start writing, you could actually even ask yourself the question before you even start doing the research. What is the target journal? What journal would be interested in this research? And so why would that be important? Different journals, they have different things that they emphasize. Some journals are more emphasize managerial relevance more. Some emphasize policy relevance. Some emphasize external validity, internal validity. Some want to see the full process behind the phenomenon that you're documenting or the effect that they're documenting. They want to see the full process shown. And so when you decide on a journal, before you even do the research, that helps you to understand what types of studies would be best suited for that audience of that journal. What type of samples? Just mTOR samples, or do we want something else? So those are decisions that ideally are made before. And of course, it doesn't guarantee that your target journal is the journal you're going to get your paper published in, or your research published in. But it's not a bad idea to just start with deciding on a journal first. If your paper gets rejected by that journal, then don't submit it as such to another journal. Rewrite. Try to write it now in the kind of blueprint for another journal, so that people who review for that journal have some sense of, familiar structure, familiar organization. Finally, I'm not a native English speaker, but I realize that I'm going to be judged as one when I submit my paper. So when I make grammatical mistakes, when I make typos, that leaves somewhat of a bad impression. And so even if you're not a native speaker, reviewers may still inadvertently draw negative inferences about you that may spill over to their assessment of your research. So ideally, if you're not a native speaker, it's probably not a bad idea to have your paper copy edited before submitting to a journal.